Following the U.S. kinetic removal of the Maduro regime in Venezuela, North Korea launched multiple ballistic missiles. The media presented this as an isolated act of defiance. This is a fundamental misreading of the strategic landscape. The missile is not the message. It is the distraction. A 900-kilometer missile launch is a loud, expensive, and mathematically futile gesture against U.S. conventional superiority. Adversaries understand this. They are not signaling a willingness to engage in a symmetric, launch-on-warning conflict they cannot win. They are signaling the activation of an asymmetric protocol. The real vector is silent. According to analysts at CSIS, the blueprint for neutralizing a global superpower does not target its military assets directly. It targets the central nervous system. The 1.3 million kilometers of subsea fiber optic cables that carry 99% of all transcontinental data and over $10 trillion in daily financial transactions. The secondary vector targets the adversary's eyes. Reports from RUSI confirm escalating research into satellite blinding and dazzling technologies. The objective is not to destroy the orbital asset, which invites kinetic reprisal, but to induce temporary, non-attributable sensor failure during a critical window. This is the operational goal: to create a blind Leviathan. A superpower with unmatched military force, but unable to see its targets, communicate with its fleets, or process the financial data that fuels its economy. The ultimate checkmate is not a nuclear fireball. It is a systemic data blackout, inducing a solvency crisis from which there is no recovery. The pivot to nuclear escalation is not driven by strength. It is a function of weakness. According to analysis from institutions like CSIS, a prolonged, unpopular conventional war becomes a critical domestic liability for a state like Russia. It depletes fiscal reserves and erodes political capital. This creates a solvency crisis, not just in financial terms, but in terms of strategic viability. The state can no longer afford the kinetic cost of a symmetric, conventional confrontation with the United States. This internal weakness forces a protocol shift. When a state's conventional assets are devalued, it must re-leverage its balance sheet towards asymmetry. It cannot compete dollar for dollar on carriers and fighter jets. It must find an asset class where a minimal investment provides maximum non-negotiable leverage. That asset is the nuclear deterrent. It is the only variable that renders superior conventional force irrelevant. The U.S. kinetic removal of the Maduro regime provides the mathematical proof. For adversarial states observing the event, the message is irrefutable. The U.S. demonstrated a blueprint for regime change against a non-nuclear state, with sources like CBS News and The Guardian confirming the strike and subsequent capture. The equation becomes brutally simple. A zero value in the nuclear deterrent variable results in a 100% probability of sovereign liquidation. Therefore, the subsequent launch of multiple ballistic missiles by North Korea is not an isolated event. It is a direct, predictable response. It is a public declaration of solvency. By demonstrating a credible launch capability, as reported across multiple outlets, Pyongyang is broadcasting to Washington that its nuclear variable is not zero. It is signaling that the Venezuelan blueprint is inapplicable. Weakness in the conventional domain forces a hard pivot to nuclear signaling as the only viable path to survival. The entire economic model of conventional warfare is now insolvent. The kinetic cost curve has inverted. According to the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, a $5 million main battle tank, a pillar of ground force projection, is now a liability. It can be neutralized and rendered a total loss by a $500 first-person view drone. This is not warfare. It is high-speed, lethal arbitrage. The phenomenon has a clinical name, the democratization of violence. It signifies the systemic collapse of the barrier to entry for projecting catastrophic force. Conventional military supremacy, the bedrock of U.S. global leverage, is facing a mathematical solvency crisis. A peer state is no longer required to liquidate a superpower's premier assets. A motivated actor with a credit card can achieve a similar kinetic outcome. The kinetic removal of the Maduro regime was not a conclusion. It was a broadcast signal. The U.S. operation in Venezuela provided a public, mathematical proof for every adversarial state. Without a nuclear deterrent, your regime's solvency is subject to U.S. conventional superiority. The immediate response was predictable. As documented, North Korea launched multiple ballistic missiles. This is not a tantrum. It is a calculated reaction to new data. But the primary theater is not where the missiles land. The core battlefield is where the protocols for destabilization are tested and refined. Intelligence communities like RUSI and CISAS identify these as gray zones or proxy laboratories, regions of engineered instability designed to test adversarial response without triggering a direct kinetic cost. Consider warnings about systemic fragility in nations previously considered stable, from key logistical hubs in southern Africa to even nodes within North America. These are not random acts of decay, they are staging grounds. These zones are used to measure the systemic damage from supply chain attacks, to test the efficacy of information warfare on allied populations, and to gauge the West's threshold for intervention. Every successful test in these laboratories, a disrupted port, a manufactured political crisis, provides a low-cost blueprint for a high-impact, non-attributable attack. For states like North Korea, observing these tests confirms their strategic calculus. It proves the system is vulnerable to asymmetric attack, reinforcing the mathematical certainty that their only guarantee of sovereignty is a credible, launch-on-warning nuclear posture. The Venezuela intervention did not contain a threat. It globalized the liability. The protocol is called launch-on-warning. According to analysts at CSIS, it is a state's response to the mathematical certainty of a decapitation strike. You do not wait for impact. You launch your own missiles the moment enemy assets are detected crossing a threshold. The alternative is a total solvency crisis. Your entire deterrent capability liquidated in its silos. The systemic vulnerability is the data. A cyber attack that blinds early warning radar does not simply remove information. It creates a new, lethal variable. This is the fog of digital war. When a U.S. kinetic action is executed, as reported in the strikes against Venezuela, it proves to states like North Korea that conventional defense is futile. They are then forced to rely on hair-trigger protocols like launch-on-warning. For the commander whose screens go black, the decision becomes a zero-sum calculation. He is not acting on fear, he is acting on the data he no longer has, weighing the kinetic cost of a false alarm against the existential cost of inaction. It transforms a localized cyber attack into a global liability. The kinetic removal of the Maduro regime, documented by CBS News, was not a conclusion. It was an accelerant. The systemic echo was immediate. North Korea launched multiple ballistic missiles, a fact confirmed by South Korea's military. This is not a diplomatic miscalculation. It is a mathematical certainty. A U.S. display of absolute conventional power in one theater forces a solvency crisis in another, providing proof that a nuclear deterrent is the only variable that balances the equation. Pyongyang's missile salvos are a public declaration of their insurance policy. However, as analysts at CSIS note, the true leverage is not in overt kinetic signaling. The next phase is asymmetric. It requires testing the U.S. response matrix to an event where attribution is deliberately obscured. The objective is to quantify the threshold of American tolerance for systemic disruption, to find the precise level of economic pain that can be inflicted below the kinetic response line. The calibration shot is therefore a predictable feature of the system. Within the next 12 months, anticipate a coordinated, cascading failure of the digital and physical infrastructure at a primary U.S. maritime logistics hub, such as the Port of Los Angeles Long Beach. It will manifest as a targeted disruption of crane automation, container tracking, and customs clearance systems, halting operations for 48 to 72 hours. The intent is not destruction. It is a non-kinetic show of force, designed to collect data on U.S. recovery timelines and prove they can inflict billions in economic damage without leaving a provable vector of attack.